It was here that the world first witnessed the scale of a catastrophe taking place beyond its consciousness. As starving Somalis streamed across the border with Kenya. The numbers had swollen dramatically well before famine was declared in July. By September, there were nearly 450,000 people pushing its boundaries. But Dadaab refugee camp has been here for 2 decades, testament to a collective failure to fix a broken country. Ibrahim Arden's 1-year-old son died this morning. It's the second child he's had to bury in Dadaab.
Another one of his sons? When did the other one die?
5 days ago.
5 days ago? In another grave? Can you show us? You can see the number of fresh graves that are here. They say there are 25 people buried in this area. Most of them have died in the last 2 weeks. And they're saying that many people in this part of the camp have fallen ill to measles. This is the same man's son, yeah? He looks really sick. How long has he been in this condition?
20 days.
In the 21st century, how could this have happened? And if famine is man-made, who is responsible? Fault Lines is travelling as close to the heart of the crisis as we can get, in order to find out.
It looks like the village is just waiting for people to die. There's nothing that you can do.
nin kasta waa noo imaanaa ninka horta daryaal ilaahay baa leh dhamasho kuligeeda ku sugnaay maxaan kaloo haynaa meel kala gaarna male ninkii noo imaado sidaa waay waa soo wartaan waa ka tagaan dad kastaba waa soo wartaan waa ka tagaan maxaan kaloo
This is what 20 years of civil war and no government can do to a capital once considered one of the most beautiful in Africa. Mogadishu is now the most dangerous city in the world. And yet, as in Dadaab, Somalis from famine-hit regions are taking huge risks to travel here and seek refuge amid the conflict and armed militias. Like the international aid organisations trying to respond to this crisis, Somalia's chaos means there are limits to how we'll be able to operate. Like many international organisations, Mogadishu is also the closest our team can get to the regions where famine has been declared. That's because in those rural areas in the south of the country, Al-Shabaab fighters remain in control. The group, which was terror-listed by the US government and has links to Al-Qaeda, has banned many Western aid organisations from working in its territory. Some Al-Shabaab spokesmen have even denied there is famine there. Those are the basic realities. The most severe drought in 60 years. 4 million Somalis facing starvation. A hardline Islamist armed group preventing some international aid from getting in. And families having to travel huge distances across front lines before receiving help. Access to the crisis is so bad that the UN says it doesn't know how many people have died. But that it's certainly in the tens of thousands, most of those children. Habiba Isaac Hassan has just arrived from the countryside. Her daughter, Makaba, lost 5 of her 7 infant children on the journey.
Does she think that the world understands what's going on here?
هذا أفرت أنتي وما أريد السلام وشيء وما أريد أدقري هذا مصور كنوع ما هو شيء وها دبكاينا Somali اسكبت دبا قبتها كوفر بحثوا هراية من الصدق الله.
It's a catastrophe there, and there's no other way of describing it. It's the worst situation that we face anywhere.
The World Food Programme is the lead UN agency for responding to famine. It doesn't have operations in the south of the country, where the famine has been at its worst.
So we have a number of operational requirements in terms of the way we provide assistance. A year and a half ago, we were unable to continue operating in southern Somalia, and Al-Shabaab has so far not allowed WFP to operate in the areas that it controls.
With WFP's operations curtailed, the onus has fallen on smaller organisations and on local ones. Sa'id was founded by a group of Somali women in the early 1990s. By working at the neighbourhood level and reaching across the clan lines that have often divided Somalia in the past, it's been able to function throughout the city, even in areas controlled by Al-Shabaab.
This organisation distributes food every day in all 16 districts of Mogadishu. At each site they're feeding 5,000 people. That means 80,000 people every single day.
Sa'id says the international community should have seen this crisis coming.
The first red flags went up for SAD, for example, in the third week of December.
Tony Burns is the group's operational director. He's been working on the ground for Sa'id since 1998.
We indicated at that time we were seeing significant numbers of new internally displaced people entering Mogadishu from rural areas. As those messages, those flags went up the chain of command, they got filtered out and ignored, essentially. So while there was pre-positioning in Ethiopia and Kenya and in northern Somalia, there was no pre-positioning in southern Somalia.
When images of the crisis started coming out, donors were forced into action. But for aid organisations in Somalia, there are strict international regulations on giving out food. Regulations that persist even in the midst of a famine.
You can see how much precision these guys are putting into this to make sure that each sack weighs as much as it's supposed to. That's indicative of how much pressure there is on aid distribution organisations to make sure that none of the food they receive is going missing.
In an effort to deprive Al-Shabaab of funding, in 2009 the US Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, imposed sanctions.
The requirement was effectively to ensure that individuals were not in contravention of U.S. law concerning support, material support or other assistance to terrorist-affiliated organizations.
The OFAC rules have meant that organizations with US funding or handling US aid must account for every last gram of food to prove it's not being diverted to Al-Shabaab or risk being prosecuted by the US government. Even at this treatment centre for malnourished babies, accountability for every item was an obvious priority.
The empty wrappers that we've seen being returned is really evidence that the mothers have to show that they've given the food supplement to their children. But it's also a way that the aid organisations can show and verify that they've actually distributed aid to people rather than it ending up in the black market or potentially in the hands of Al-Shabaab.
Sa'id told us the OFAC rules made it risky to consider extending their operations beyond Mogadishu.
It's incredibly intimidating. We take our mandate to the Somali population very seriously, but the legal ramifications and the financial ramifications to an organisation that has no recurrent funding are at this point enormous, to the point that we may have to walk away, even in a famine.
With a full-blown famine clearly unfolding, in August, Washington said it was relaxing the rules.
The OFAC regulations have clearly been modified to reflect an evolving situation, and those OFAC licenses have been opened and granted to some 12 international organizations to be able to operate in south-central Somalia.
But by the time the rules were changed, some 29,000 children under the age of 5 had died from starvation. The malnutrition has been most severe among infant children. 18-month-old Mohammed Abshalamar had escaped the famine zone 3 days before we met him at the end of September. His mother, Asha, told us there was still no aid reaching her town.
Why do you think this wasn't done earlier if there was an acknowledgement that there was going to be a crisis on this scale?
You know, quite frankly, the demand surged as the crisis surged. And that's when we moved. But again, I want to be very clear that never did those sanctions stipulate that you can't provide assistance to Somalia. I think that's been an interpretation, but that's an inaccurate interpretation.
But by the end of 2010, US humanitarian aid to Somalia had dropped by almost 90% of what it was before the OFAC sanctions were imposed, as the drought struck and famine loomed.
There was a time when the pipeline of WFP was really bad, and the reason was because the United States was not quite sure whether the food that comes is also benefiting the terrorists.
Aid levels didn't rise again until famine was officially declared in July.
Has there been a decision by this administration to attempt to destabilize al-Shabaab by cutting aid to those areas that are under their control?
We think that al-Shabaab is a destabilizing force inside of Somalia.
But we're talking about 4 million people now facing starvation.
Shabaab is a problem, and it constitutes a serious terrorist threat.
Clearly, it was a US political decision not to allow their resources into South and Central Somalia, and understanding that the US has historically been the most generous and the largest donor and partner for South and Central Somalia, it has made a systemic difference.
Obviously, this OFAC policy has cost lives. The question is how many thousands of lives has it cost?
So what we have done here in the United States and elsewhere is to partner in a very bizarre way with Shabaab in punishing the local population.
For our organization and for our staff, it's a sense of failure that this has occurred again, that they've tried their best. We've looked for ways to raise these flags with the international community, and nothing has happened.
Does it make you angry?
Yes, but there's nothing we can do. We're on the bottom.
The American embassy in Mogadishu hasn't been functional since Somalia's last great famine. In the early 90s, some 300,000 people starved as conflict between rival warlords blocked aid delivery to the south. The US led a UN force to open the aid routes. An offensive against the warlord in control of Mogadishu turned into a fatal battle, and his militias shot down 2 Black Hawk helicopters. 18 American soldiers were killed.
There hasn't been a permanent US mission here in Mogadishu for many years now, but some say it was the Black Hawk Down incident in 1993 that started the US disengagement from Somalia. This former embassy is now home to more than 16,000 Somali IDPs.
For some, what remains here has come to symbolize the neglect with which the US treated Somalia throughout the late 1990s. Just 5 years later, after the US embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and after 9/11, US interest resurged. William Bellamy was the US ambassador to Kenya from 2003 to 2006.
And indeed, al-Qaeda in East Africa was an active and very dangerous presence. And I think there's no doubt that at that point, 2003, 2004, 2005, the overriding focus of US policy was on dealing with that particular threat.
As the CIA cultivated relationships with rival warlords they thought would help fight the rise of what they saw as radical Islamism, a new political formation took control and brought law and order to Mogadishu. The Union of Islamic Courts, with al-Shabaab as its military wing.
I think it was a fairly well thought out policy at the time, but it was in the end ultimately not a successful one.
But the choices made next were to make things even worse.
I'm absolutely confident that if the Ethiopians did not invade Somalia, Shabab would have remained a very small fragment of the Union Islamic Courts.
I think the problem of the Islamic Courts Union is it was overtaken by radicals, right? It was overtaken by the East Africa Al-Qaeda cell, right? And it was overtaken by the military arm of the Islamic Courts Union.
In the summer of 2006, Washington backed Somalia's neighbor and sworn enemy Ethiopia in a full-scale invasion and occupation to rid the country of Al-Shabaab. Jendai Fraser was the State Department's senior official for Africa at the time.
I think that's really misunderstood. It's claimed that we supported them, we even pushed them in. In fact, myself and Secretary Rice were on the phone with Prime Minister Meles, urging him not to go into Somalia.
But you supported it with air support and military support after the fact, right?
Yeah, true. Intelligence support, primarily, not military support, intelligence support. In other words, where we had intelligence about certain targets that were high-value targets to the United States, we certainly made sure that they understood where those targets were.
The horror of the Ethiopian invasion was really its occupation of Mogadishu for so many years. Not only did it destroy the Somali economy, it threw so many people out of their homes, it catapulted the Shabab to power.
The 1.5 million people who were displaced by the Ethiopian occupation, which was supported by the United States, which ultimately gave birth to the dominance of Al-Shabaab. That's the genealogy, if you like, of the current famine.
There are still foreign troops in Mogadishu, but today they're from Uganda and Burundi. The Ethiopians have been replaced by an African Union mission of more than 9,000 soldiers. Washington provides logistical support, including weapons, equipment, even funds for private military contractors from DC-based firm Bancroft, who advise and train AMISOM forces. 6 weeks before fault lines arrived, Al-Shabaab fighters withdrew from much of the city.
We're driving to a neighborhood in the north part of the city where African Union troops are having daily engagement with Al-Shabaab fighters. So far, we've only seen the neighborhoods which have been taken back from where Al-Shabaab used to occupy. Now we're going to the front line.
While AMISOM is fighting by conventional means in Mogadishu, and Kenyan and Ethiopian troops have invaded to secure buffer zones on their borders, the Obama administration has ramped up drone attacks in southern Somalia. They have reportedly killed key Al-Shabaab leaders. In the fortified trench on Mogadishu's edge, a senior commander tells us AMISOM is now in control of 95% of the city.
Do you think there are even now Shabab coming in and out?
Yeah, you cannot rule out that one, because they are Somalis, they are citizens of this country. They can move in civilian clothes. We do have them, they must be there. But intelligence, TFG intelligence has been picking one by one, and the police, they've been picking them. Yeah.
Just 2 weeks later, a suicide truck bombing outside a government compound killed dozens. Al-Shabaab has claimed responsibility and pledged a new campaign of guerrilla tactics against the transitional federal government. Widely believed to be corrupt and incompetent, the TFG couldn't survive in Mogadishu without African Union troops and international support. For the US government, it's a growing concern.
The TFG is a transitional entity. The intent is not that it is going to be the permanent government of Somalia, but is going to manage this difficult transitional process through to emergence of a more permanent government.
Hello. Nice to meet you. Sebastian Walker from Al Jazeera.
Once a member of the Union of Islamic Courts, Sheikh Sharif Sheikh Ahmed was pegged as a moderate and installed as president of the TFG with US backing in 2009. But there's a sense of betrayal now when he speaks of those who brought him to power.
dowladda Mareykanka dowladda meesha lagu dhisayna waa joogeen oo shirkii Djibouti oo ka socday iyo shirkii ka horeeyay ee lagu qabtay Kenya taageeradooda mal walba joogta ahayd laakiin waxa aan isweydiin karnaa waxay taageeradooda ma gaartay heerkii ay u baahnaayeen dowladda iyo shacabka Soomaaliyeed ma gaarin.
Within the TFG's motley army, the US has found some uneasy allies.
We were just about to leave our hotel to go meet one of the most notorious warlords in Mogadishu, Inda Ade. But our guys have told us that they've heard that his militias were organizing to try and make some kind of move against us. So we've been told to stay put at our hotel. But he's now agreed to come here and do the interview right here.
During the 90s, Inda Ade controlled the Lower Shabelle region in the south, where he was feared for his brutality. By 2006, he was part of the Union of Islamic Courts, and his militias were at the service of Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda. But he's changed sides again. A general in the Somali National Army, he now gets his weapons from Amazon.
أنا TFG عند هذا مركا أنا رجع بنان كتاعن نقول دري أنا TFG عنا مريكن كا أنا مريكن كصاحبنا.
What does it feel like for you to be fighting on the other side now? Because you were initially fighting on the side that he's describing as Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda.
المرون نرتا أنا حقا كسوجي ما أنا هو جميع وهذا. أنا أسميه أساسي أمريكان كا ما أنا فكرة دي كبوري هذا وأنقابه إن صوماليا ديمقراطية اللي معموله سيادة وقتها وعنقر صدام معهم.
And do you think they find that unacceptable, the CIA?
وأصير كي مداني أنا وجد دانله أنا قارن ما أملينا يا أيوة أنا أقبل أيان هذا إن واشنطن كتاب كلا يلوحكم ما أقبل أيان أنا ما أقبل أيان صوماليا ولا إسلامه عند ديمقراطية اللوحكم.
In light of the TFG's weakness, the US has shifted course again, backing any political figure, warlord or district commissioner who they believe will serve as a buffer against Al-Shabaab. In Washington circles, it's called dual track.
The first track is designed to support the TFG, and the second track is designed to reach out to groups throughout South Central Somalia who are opposed to Al-Shabaab.
The dual track approach is a disaster, point blank.
To its critics, it sounds like the failed policies of the past and is likely to fragment the country even further.
They have put this project on the table, and so warlords, criminals, dictators, regional fiefdoms all of a sudden now are putting on this new garb of saying we are part of the new agenda.
As the crisis in the south continues to unfold, in Mogadishu, the impact of 2 decades of failed international policy have made it difficult to respond. At Banadir Hospital, the pediatrics ward is overwhelmed with tiny children, starving, dehydrated, suffering from acute diarrhea. The room reflects the new geopolitical dynamics of the famine response. Islamic aid organizations are filling in where UN and Western groups can't or won't go. Alongside Somali staff, they're racing to save 3-month-old Asha's life. As they do what they can to beat back death, the rest of the world is moving on, casting our gaze and pointing our cameras elsewhere.
It's Shabaab, it's the United States, it's the transitional federal government, it's the United Nations Office for Somalia. All of these are partners to the policies and politics that produce the famine. And so powerful people have that privilege of denying reality. But I think if they look into the mirror and fear their creator, they would recognize that they may not have willfully decided to starve people, but that the policies that they have prosecuted in the region over the last 15, 20 years is party to the creation of a disaster that's the Somali famine. They can deny all they want, but the Almighty knows, and there is no way they can fool the Almighty.
waa sawirtaan waa ka tagaan dad kastaba waa sawirtaan waa ka tagaan maxaa kale
This is what 20 years of civil war and no government can do to a capital once considered one of the most beautiful in Africa. Mogadishu is now the most dangerous city in the world. And yet, as in Dadaab, Somalis from famine-hit regions are taking huge risks to travel here and seek refuge amid the conflict and armed militias. Like the international aid organisations trying to respond to this crisis, Somalia's chaos means there are limits to how we'll be able to operate. Like many international organisations, Mogadishu is also the closest our team can get to the regions where famine has been declared. That's because in those rural areas in the south of the country, Al-Shabaab fighters remain in control. The group, which was terror-listed by the US government and has links to Al-Qaeda, has banned many Western aid organisations from working in its territory. Some Al-Shabaab spokesmen have even denied there is famine there. Those are the basic realities. The most severe drought in 60 years.
You can see the number of fresh graves that are here. They say there are 25 people buried in this area. Most of them have died in the last 2 weeks. And they're saying that many people in this part of the camp have fallen ill to measles. This is the same man's son, yeah? He looks really sick. How long has he been in this condition?
20 days.
In the 21st century, how could this have happened? And if famine is man-made, who is responsible? Fault Lines is travelling as close to the heart of the crisis as we can get, in order to find out.
It looks like the village is just waiting for people to die. There's nothing that you can do.
nin kastaba waa noo imaanaa ninka horta daryaal ilaahay baa leh dhamasho kuligeeda ku sugnaay maxaan kaloo haynaa meel kala gaarna ma leh ninkii noo imaada sidaa waay.
It was here that the world first witnessed the scale of a catastrophe taking place beyond its consciousness. As starving Somalis streamed across the border with Kenya. The numbers had swollen dramatically well before famine was declared in July. By September, there were nearly 450,000 people pushing its boundaries. But Dadaab refugee camp has been here for 2 decades, testament to a collective failure to fix a broken country. Ibrahim Arden's 1-year-old son died this morning. It's the second child he's had to bury in Dadaab.
Another one of his sons. When did the other one die?
5 days ago.
5 days ago? In another grave? Can he show us?
Millions Somalis facing starvation. A hardline Islamist armed group preventing some international aid from getting in. And families having to travel huge distances across front lines before receiving help. Access to the crisis is so bad that the UN says it doesn't know how many people have died, but that it's certainly in the tens of thousands, most of those children.
Somalia waa iska baahan tahay. Inta ma aragtay akii lama wada kiisa duwal ilmaha ma aragtay bulshada shiban mantag yaa ugu dhamado haya. Gaajo waa hore ma ku joogaan.
Habiba Isaac Hassan has just arrived from the countryside. Her daughter, Makaba, lost 5 of her 7 infant children on the journey.
Does she think that the world understands what's going on here?